Does pelvic floor relaxation equate to stretching a muscle? I don't know. What are the connections between CrossFit and yoga? And what's the best way to do hip openers with yoga to prepare for pregnancy and postpartum? All these questions we dive into today with Dr. Ariele Foster, yoga practitioner and physical therapist. Let's start the show. All right, so today we are talking yoga, and I did a post recently talking about, pelvic floor and Zen pelvic floor and yoga poses came up, and I'm so glad that my dear friend Ariele Foster, she popped in and said, "Hold up here, we need to educate a little bit more about yoga." And she literally has the legacy of yoga in her bones. But we used to work together at Georgetown University Hospital, and so I'm calling a favor here. And Ariele Foster, who's APT and owner of Yoga Anatomy Academy, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I mentioned legacy. Like I remember talking to you, like how far back does yoga go in your family?
Sure. So my grandmother taught yoga. When I was a little kid, I would go to her yoga classes. At the time, I lived in a very rural part of Virginia called Rappahannock County, and I don't think it was necessarily a word that she used to describe her classes, but it was absolutely what she was teaching. And she had studied with a number of yoga teachers. And then when I was kind of in high school, I went to a public school, but it was an alternative school for the city, very similar to a charter school. So we didn't have a gym, and the teachers had to teach things. And so I took yoga from my English teacher in high school. And this sounds maybe normal or common these days, but in the 90s, this was not normal. And having as much exposure to yoga through the integral style that was somewhat common in my hometown, to my guitar teacher being also a yoga teacher who would have me come to class, to my grandmother. It was a lot of exposure. And even in the late 90s, first year of the 2000s, I was studying yoga in college. So when I first started teaching in 2001, it was rare to meet a yoga teacher.
And it's sort of evolved a bit, right? Like now we've got like
Yes.
core power yoga and yoga at Gold's Gym and kind of all this stuff. Like yoga's obviously gone a bit more mainstream. And with that comes some myths and some misconceptions about it. And that's why I wanted you to come on, because you know all the things. And with us having worked together in the past, you're also super educated about where that kind of fits in the pelvic floor. And so I think we'll have a good chat about that. What are the I think let's start with the comment that you made. You're like, physical therapists recommending yin yoga or long holds, and I had to look that one up, for pelvic floor relaxation. Like, let's just unpack that to start, because I think a lot of providers are like, oh, you need to relax. Let's do a nice long hold. Let's do yoga.
Okay, so first of all, I just need to be clear with everyone that I'm not a pelvic floor physical therapist. I am a physical therapist, but I deal with more general orthopedic, full body chronic pain and a lot of hip issues. So fortunately, the hip is adjacent to the pelvic floor, but it is not the pelvic floor.
They're
So I am not
buddies. They're
not a pelvic
buddies.
floor
All
expert.
good. I'll do the translation.
Great. And that being said, I do have this arc of longevity in the yoga space. And one style of yoga is called yin yoga. Now, in reality, there is more than one way that a yin yoga could go if in real life if you show up. But the classical, quote unquote classical, because it was just created, this style was literally invented in the 80s. It that what we would consider like the original style of yin yoga is 4-minute holds in poses with zero support, zero props. So imagine a kind of a restorative pose. You're lying on your back, the soles of your feet together, your knees are out to the sides, and you feel a little stretch on your inner thighs. This is the position that you might hold for 4 minutes straight in a conventional yin yoga class. And in that time, what's actually happening is it gets really uncomfortable, as you can imagine, right? So
It
it gets
doesn't sound
uncomfortable in
fun to me,
different.
by the way.
It does not. It gets uncomfortable in different places for different people. And when folks are in this position for a long time, especially if the teacher is saying, okay, don't use any support, relax, keep breathing through the discomfort, things like that, that might be appropriate, for example, if you're in labor, may not be appropriate in that exact moment. It might not be the best use of your time for your body. There are myths around yin yoga, like it will make your fascia more supple. It will stretch your ligaments. That's probably not actually a myth. It's probably kind of true, because the actual reflex arc that is natural and normal for your body is completed by second 90, by the 90-second mark, right? And so after that, your spinal reflexes, they'll probably still kind of have waves of kicking in, if in reality, but the actuality is that your natural instincts, your actual reflexes to get out of that position,
Yeah.
or the stretch reflex, they're overridden in a class like that. And in any position that would be a low load prolonged stretch, or even a high load prolonged stretch. What do I mean by low load prolonged stretch? That's a phrase directly from the literature. And it basically means, from what I remember from PT school, is it means like a 4-minute stretch or longer. So very similar to uh, yin yoga,
Mhm.
and appropriate under very selective circumstances, such as
Right.
post-surgical circumstances,
Yeah.
where someone is at risk of what's called a contracture, meaning the joint stiffens up into an unnatural position, can't really be used normally. But in this style of, and I truly do not mean to pick on yin yoga, I'll pick on other things in the near
Hey,
future.
I brought it up, so it's
Yes,
I brought it
yes.
up.
Again, I want to recognize that the actual people teaching yin yoga are probably teaching in more humane ways that allow for props and that allow for different stuff.
That's what
But
I was thinking, yeah.
the
Like,
very
props are
fundamental
pretty
aspects of it.
common, right? Like, props, I think more in less strict situations to support those poses and things like that, and I was even thinking, you mentioned labor and delivery, like, you at least have somebody there holding your leg, like, that's considered a prop. I think if you're in labor and you're pushing and that sort of thing, you've got somebody holding your leg a little bit, so this is just, like, static, no support, but the goal is just to kinda hang in that position as long as you can.
Yes. And something similar happens in, like I said, I'm going to pick on some other modalities now. Something similar happens in contortion training, right? Or if you get into the splits and you hold it for a long time, that might
Mm,
not be a quote low load, because your entire body weight is most likely dropping into the,
gotcha.
the hamstrings and hip flexors and
Yep,
everything else that's being pulled
that's
on.
that's what my nine-year-old's trying to do right now. She desperately wants to do the splits, and I think her dad's genetics are gonna help with that a little bit. Mine are probably gonna fight it, but the older she gets, the less she can get in there to get that going. Um, so kinda splits into hip openers, like, one of the things that comes up a lot with, pregnant moms is they should be practicing yoga for hip openers. Um, in a typical yoga class, that's not directed towards that, what would that look like? And then, if you have any knowledge as far as, like, a more kind of a pregnancy-related one, would that differ at all?
Um, okay, so hip opener, as you probably know, hip openers are, it's a pretty undefined term. In the yoga space, what it typically implies is, I'm going to use some technical language, external rotation, horizontal
That
abduction.
would be
So,
turning out
yeah,
and bringing out. Yep.
the position that would allow someone to sit comfortably cross legged with the knees and the thighs touching the floor. Um, so, typically, the way the term hip opener gets translated through yoga people brains is into a pose like pigeon pose,
Mhm.
which is, if you're not familiar with it, you might, probably the best thing would be to look it up. But pigeon pose, and there's more than one, but typically it's the back leg is stretched back like a kind of like a split, but the front leg is in, um, it has the knee deeply bent or partially bent. And so you can practice pigeon pose in a few different ways, but it's think of it like a more comfortable version of those splits. And
Yep.
then people will sometimes lay over their front leg and try to make it more of a relaxation pose. And it falls under that same category that I'm speaking of with yin yoga, because I think the bigger distinction is not yin yoga or yang yoga or anything like this, but really the concept of passive stretching
Mhm.
being equated with relaxed muscles.
Yes, that's what I wanted to get at. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is those things are not the same.
Yeah.
Okay, let's repeat that for everybody in the back. So
I'm
a
giggling because
passive
Carrie definitely knows this information.
well, and I think that's the part that kinda drives me a little nuts is that,
Mhm.
and I remember this from a PT perspective, and my very first foray into, yoga versus Pilates was if you wanted to get relaxed and get mobility, you did yoga. If you wanted to strengthen, you did Pilates, and I think that is just an insane oversimplification. If you spend 30 seconds in a decent yoga class, we're holding an asana, like, I don't care if you're, like, you're talking 4 minutes. I'm lucky to hold, like, 10 seconds, in a particular pose, like, that requires, yes, mobility, but control and coordination and, Pilates, like, you've gotta do that too, and you have to breathe in
Yeah.
all of these things, and so I don't know where that started, if that was, like, us trying to make it medically black and white, but, um, but again, like, to your point, a muscle stretching it is not the same as getting it to relax. So, what do you do if you have somebody that you're like, "All right, I know you need this. I know you need to relax." How can yoga play a role in the relax piece when they're coming in with this kind of misconception that they just need to stretch like crazy?
Um, I think that yoga, like Tai Chi, like Qigong, like a number of other modalities, somatics, like there's so many movement modalities, I couldn't name them all, that have a really profound mind body connection.
Yeah.
I would say that even things that aren't typically thought of as having a mind body connection, like running or weight training, can be profoundly mind body connecting activities.
Yep.
And yoga does play a fairly unique role, or it has historically, in that it is slower than a lot of other modalities, not necessarily all classes, but there's enough classes that have a slow enough pace where you really can be mindful. Sometimes the
Mhm.
cues are extraordinarily picky. Most likely, these really picky cues are not anatomical either, but that's beside the point at this exact moment, because it can increase your body mind map, your body mind awareness to think about turning your toes out 30 degrees. And so to
Mhm.
that effect, a quote unquote picky cue that may have no anatomic um, integrity is still potentially useful in that mind body connection way. So many people who are carrying excess tension in their muscles probably are not consciously aware that they're doing
Mm,
that. And so when you can bring in any kind of modality that allows for increased mind body connection, that's the first
yes.
step, right? Like the
Yep.
12-step programs, the first one is admitting there's something there.
Yes.
And then beyond that, I think that the history of yoga, a moment ago, I was kind of looking around to see if my copy of Light on Yoga was within reach. The history of yoga in the United States is much of it stems from a handful of traditions, specifically three men who had an outsized influence on the um, types of yoga and the styles
Mm,
of yoga and the general vibes of yoga
It's the
in the United
patriarchy
States.
again.
Yeah, maybe. But BKS Iyengar was one of the most
Mhm.
influential yoga teachers uh, to the United States. And I'm speaking to not exclusively to the United States, but just because that is
Right.
exclusively what I know. And BKS Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga, makes absolutely fantastical claims about all of the health benefits of
Mm.
um, yoga poses, various yoga poses. And it really came out at a time, this book came out at a time. This is the famous book with the black and white photos of Mr. Iyengar in a wild array, hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 different poses of yoga.
Mhm.
And it came out a long time ago. I want to say in the 50s or the 60s. And each pose is associated with a list of health benefits
Oh my
that
goodness.
truly are fantastical, as I said before, meaning kind of fantasy based.
Yeah.
Like it says things like, do headstand for headaches. I don't quote me on that, but that was something that a true yoga
Yeah.
teacher told me in the early 2000s. And I remember I had a sinus headache and headstand didn't feel good at that moment, kind of like no
Oh, I
duh.
can't even imagine. Your head would explode.
Yeah. And but I was very deep in the weeds of believing that this practice had all of the answers. And
Mhm.
no wonder given its history. And so people continue to look to yoga as um, a magical activity with,
Mhm.
I like to call it sort of, if you've ever heard of the book Mating in Captivity, we talk about how we put so much pressure on our romantic partners these days, where we want them to be our housemates, our business partners, our co-parents, our lovers, and it's very hard to keep up with all of those activities all at once, to play
I will
all of
agree.
those roles very
Yes,
well.
I would agree.
Very excellent thesis in that respect. And we do that to yoga, where it's like yoga is your gym, yoga is your church,
We
yoga
want it
is
to
your
be all the things.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that has shifted for sure. The dynamics of all of this has shifted in the last few years with the pandemic. But that's a little bit around the background as to why someone starts to ascribe um, really like extra magical, fantastical powers
Yeah.
to stretching. It comes from a tradition of yoga sort of hyping itself up without evidence.
Well, I think like and it's funny when yoga tends to come up as an option for a lot of people. Like I'm a child of the 70s too, and I remember it just being like super hippie in the 80s. I started going to a local studio much more frequently. I guess it was it was after we had our miscarriage, and for me, it wasn't a I didn't wanna go run. I didn't feel like I wanted to lift weights. Like, I needed kind of like that easy I needed to move, but I also needed some space and some peace, and for me, that was and I had a wonderful teacher. Granted, I was at 6:30 AM with, like, a bunch of 60-year-olds, which was totally my pace at that point, but I think a lot of people turn to it in pregnancy, postpartum because it's supposed to be easier on the body, and I get that a lot from moms that are very active CrossFitters when their OB is like, well, maybe you should try yoga. And like the headspace is incredibly different between the two. The music is definitely different. The volume is definitely different. But for me, I think there's a time and a place and a space. And for me, like I found so much you talk about kind of notice and awareness and that kind of stuff to be aware of what was going on and you have that quiet to look inside your body and see what's going on. It was very kind of very spiritual for me because of that time of loss. But I continued through my pregnancy with my daughter, whereas I hadn't done yoga with my son. Um, and it was definitely such an eye-opening experience to be close to like 40, 50 pounds heavier and try and find that movement and that peace in this odd body of mine. But again, like I think there was a little bit more forgiveness because of the space that it was in. I don't that was my experience. But again, I feel like a lot of women come to it because they're taught to do less during yoga. But I've worked with so many yoga teachers over the years, pregnancy and postpartum, that like they're still doing all the crazy shoulder stands and headstands and all these movements that I really could never do anyway. That yoga isn't just the easy option. Like it can be quite strenuous, right?
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about why somebody would go to yoga. I think there's a number of reasons. One of which is that like, um, it basically, there's somebody telling you what to do, which is really
Yes.
refreshing
Big
sometimes.
fan of that.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes that's honestly really refreshing. You know you should move, and it's that time where you want to suspend the brain that may have been on all day and making decisions all day, and then so somebody's telling you what to do. That's a really powerful thing. Somebody's telling you to relax at the end. There is a genuine,
Yeah.
hopefully at minimum 5 minutes of relaxation, of true relaxation, and there is movement in between that can sometimes be quite strenuous, and there's movement that can be very like intriguing, kind of mapping that mind body connection. There are cues through breath. So there's a lot that
Yes.
really uplifts a lot of people, especially in a time when you are dealing with overwhelm, whether that's grief, whether that's just everyday life, which can also be really overwhelming. It can create a really, there's something about the foundational recipe, we'll call it, of a yoga asana class as we know it, that is that plays a really extraordinary role in people's lives. And at the same time, there's this over attribution of benefits that
Mhm.
could come from yoga and an oversimplification, just like anything. Like when I was a brand new PT in 2011, CrossFit was really gaining a lot of steam, and I remember
Yeah.
saying a couple things like maybe don't do CrossFit to a couple people who had been injured in CrossFit, and I think that is an inappropriate thing now, knowing what I now know, because it was the more appropriate is to teach actually progressive how to
Yeah.
build yourself up so that you do not
Right.
get injured.
And
There's
it's
also a mindset.
moderation. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
also moderation of, like, don't go balls out for everything. That
yeah.
that that works for yoga too. Don't go all out on yoga right off the bat.
Yes. And I think something that CrossFit and yoga have in common is that it can be difficult, the on ramp can be
Mm,
difficult to practice elegantly. And let me just
yes.
say that when you and I are speaking about yoga right now, I just think that it's really, really important to contextualize this phrase yoga, that yoga is actually a lot bigger than what we know. It's a lot more than just yoga classes. It's a lot more than just asana or poses. One can be a yoga practitioner and never ever touch a sticky mat in their life.
Mm,
And that's a really important distinction that uh, um, has been overshadowed dramatically in the last 15 years of the increasing popularity of yoga. But that aside, the on ramp to something like uh, yoga asana practice or CrossFit practice can be really challenging because that's when you need the most moderation, and
yes.
you're also the least aware
Yes.
potentially.
Yes. No, I feel the same. I mean, I've been doing CrossFit now, I think 6 years. I did regular yoga practice 7 or 8 years, and then my teacher left, and we'll have a
Mm.
conversation about voices and teachers and that sort of thing in a second, but, um, I just feel like you have much more familiarity with just sometimes just the culture and the words and what comes first and kind of the order of things that you can spend a little bit more time kind of diving into how you feel in a certain movement or certain details of a technique or how you play with different things. I think that does come with any sort of movement with time and experience. But yeah, in the beginning, it's sort of, drinking from the fire hose. Even if it's a kind of an easy beginner class, because you're just trying to take in a lot of stuff and also understand sort of what's going on in your body. But let's talk a second about voices. And I mean this in a couple different ways. One is the actual literal voice, and then the other is kind of, a teacher's approach, because lots of different studios that people find, or videos on TV, or, on the internet or whatever. There's a lot of different options to choose from. So if I'm either pregnant or postpartum and I'm considering, okay, I want to find my space in yoga. For you, I'm sure you've been to a bajillion different teachers over the years. What are some recommendations that you have to help people figure out, and also to understand that there are different kind of flavors and different things like that? What are some recommendations to help people find the voice and the culture and the space for them?
Okay, so if someone were just really gung ho that they want to find yoga and they hadn't yet found it, I I think I recommend what I did back in my 20s. Was I was so hungry for knowledge. This was not free internet, but it was, we weren't walking around with computers in our hands. And so in order, particularly before 2005, 2006, there really was so little yoga that I would go to yoga classes and like take notes, right?
Yeah.
Because it was hard to find that information.
Yep.
So I would always have like a notebook when I would go to yoga. I'd be like, okay, I had to pay, 10 or 12 bucks for this class at that
Just to
time.
learn, right?
Oh, and I was like absolutely broke. And so I would, splurge and then go and like write all this stuff down because I was so hungry for that knowledge. And I tried so many styles of yoga over a 5 or 6 year period that I am really grateful for, because it's enabled me to be a much better teacher of yoga
Yes.
teachers now,
Yep.
and a much better physical therapist to yoga practitioners now. And I recommend that. I recommend just going out there, finding what you like. For those who are on YouTube, as you mentioned, definitely my classes are the best.
Of course.
I'm joking, but
Now,
one of
you've
the
done YouTube for a
interesting,
long time, though. You've put your stuff up far longer than, this recent YouTube surge. You've been up there a long time.
yeah, I've got some classes dating back to 2016, and I will say that it's very interesting to look back over the arc of my teaching and
Mhm.
see how much has changed.
Yes.
I have lost a lot of tolerance to some of the wishy-washy, sort of less anatomical stuff. And I thought in 2016, if you had asked me, you know, had you cut out a lot of the fluff, I would have thought I cut out a lot. But yeah, it's interesting to watch that arc, and some of the more popular classes are just the ones that have been on YouTube for the longest,
Yeah.
and therefore somebody liked it and it gained a little steam. And they're not necessarily the classes that I am the most proud of today, right?
It
Like
never
if you
is.
look
It's
at the new
always
stuff,
the other
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, we're both in spaces that have a lot of evolution.
Mhm.
Like I was listening to some of your podcasts recently, and you've mentioned a number of times that you do less and less internal work,
Yeah.
or less than you ever have before, and that your approach is, I would guess, more big picture and less
Yep.
reductive than it used to be. Um, yeah, and my teaching and my physical therapy practice have also changed over the years.
Yeah. No, I think, to your point, like, understanding that where you start in your yoga journey is gonna be different than where, you evolve and you end and that sort of thing. Like, I'm feeling the need to go back again,
Hmm.
just because I'm feeling a kind of that need for that space, especially after the last 3 years.
Yes, yes.
Um, and I think as I get older too, um, knowing that I need this kind of mashup of different things. Like, I need the cardio, I need the weightlifting, going into perimenopause, all that fun stuff. That's a whole other conversation. But not so much that I need the mobility. I feel like I do that on a regular basis, but I need that space to be able to move. But it definitely is a much more of I dare say, like, it's like this sacred place, just like running for me is feels incredibly that way. The things that I always go back to, um, they had this beautiful, like, woven carpet that was made out of some grass or something. I don't know what it was. And so we're in your bare feet and just feeling that, and just how many times you walk around and not feel what's under your feet. And it's one of the things that I start with all of my patients, like, we can't change what we don't notice. And how often, especially as we get older and busier, and all the obligations that we have, that we don't have that time and space to notice what's going on. And we have less F's to give, but we have less time to notice, and we got to make that space for it. So for me, that very much feeling, now that the kids, I only started to go to yoga, I guess because of the miscarriage, and really kind of found space. And because the kids were still sleeping early, now I can't because they're busy all the time. So now it's also finding that move for it. Um, Question for you. I have definitely heard more yoga teachers referring to the pelvic floor, but also referring to mula banda, and referring to it. I've seen it separately. I've seen it used interchangeably. Um, Give me a little take on that from kind of your experience. First of all, what you see is mula bandha and pelvic floor, and then where there may be some crossover connection.
Yeah, let me pick up on one other thread real quick, which is that, making time for yoga. I think it's easy to downplay practices that are not full 60 or 90-minute practices that don't
Yes.
include like a substantial
Ooh,
warm up and a chant and then close with a shavasana. But if you have 10 minutes between the time your alarm goes off and the kid's alarm goes off, or whatever it is, or you
yep.
have to like wrestle them out of the bed, that's valid. Those 10 minutes are valid. So if that's all you do, kudos to you.
Thank you for saying that, because there was definitely a time where I'm like, if I couldn't have this perfect practice, it wasn't going to happen. And I think I shot myself in the foot by doing that. So listen to Ariel.
Perfectionism is rampant in the yoga space, and
Mm,
it is there is a fine line between perfectionism and ableism. In fact, no line whatsoever. And when I say ableism, it's a sort of exclusion of people with differently abled bodies physically.
mhm.
But you could also expand that definition. You exclude people with differently configured lives. Like some of us
Yes.
have two jobs and still deserve to have a full practice. And when we're
Yep.
thinking of yoga as it's exclusively this thing that starts in seated with a chanting opening and then ends with a 10-minute shavasana, you actually are being extraordinarily exclusive and
Yes.
ableist even in that approach. And so that is something that
That's a
does
great point.
get under my skin. And the mula bandha is not the same thing as a pelvic floor,
Thank you.
period. They are not the same thing. The pelvic floor is an anatomic space, and mula bandha is an energetic practice according to the texts. Mula bandha is taught in different ways as an energetic act or as an actual something that is closer to a kegel or
Mhm.
kegel. And there's no one right or wrong way to practice mula bandha. Well, actually, there is a wrong way, and the wrong way is to practice holding it all at all times or for the duration of a 60 to 90-minute class. It
Which
is
we don't wanna do with
absolutely,
our pelvic floor either. All bad news. Don't do that.
yeah. So there is a profound upsurge, and it could be what the algorithm is feeding me, but there
Mhm.
is a profound upsurge in folks in the yoga space, yoga teachers and wellness teachers using more kind of scientific and anatomic words
Mhm.
to describe what they do. And are sometimes incredibly valuable contributions coming from these individuals that are helping a lot of people. more often than not, what is actually happening is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is essentially you know a tiny bit and
Yep.
your confidence zooms way up and you actually, the more expertise you gain, the less confidence you have
Mhm.
in a good way, honestly.
Yeah.
So those of us who've been practicing physical therapists for more than 10 years, I mean, I recently saw an advertisement by a very well-known yoga teacher who uh, her bio now reads Harvard certified anatomy expert. And I think to myself, okay, Harvard is a degree conferring institution. So but certification is not a degree. So let me look and see, does Harvard actually offer certification? So I typed in
Yeah, I
certification
can
in
already tell you it
anatomy,
doesn't.
Harvard. It does not. There is a 6-week online anatomy course that you can take, which is very financially savvy of Harvard to take their expertise
Right.
and serve the public in this way and earn a little money on the side. And so this famous yoga teacher, she took that 6-week online course through Harvard and now claims to be a Harvard certified anatomy expert. Now she has been in the anatomy space. She studied with a massage therapist who's a well-known anatomy teacher in the yoga space and some other stuff. But it's astounding. And her class that I
Yeah.
was fed, the algorithm, the ad that I was fed was about stretching the vagus nerve.
Just for those in the back, how about how the vagus nerve? It's kind of important, right? Like, and you can't stretch nerves, by the way. There's that too. But
You can, and they will immediately fight back. They will be very
yeah, the
angry at
Vegas is
you.
like that fight or flight sort of scenario. No, I think you can find examples of that. I always get in the conversation of the blessing and curse of social media and obviously
Mhm.
ads. And I think it brings up an interesting point where I do have more. I've seen more people that are in like yoga and Pilates space trying to um, exert more expertise by using anatomical words, um, albeit oversimplified or incorrectly or that sort of thing. And I think that's where, and that's where you're such a lovely combination of you have this incredible background in yoga. You understand the history, you understand where things are coming from, you understand kind of the why behind stuff, but then also can mash that up with your medical background as a physical therapist. And so for people that like they're going to yoga, they're learning about it, they learn about these anatomical words or they hear mula banda or they think things like that. Like I think it's important to note that it's a start to make a connection, but really there's practitioners like you that really have that medical side, that have that kind of cultural historical movement experience, and that's really where you can find that good information and that connection. I know when I'm in classes, and I used to hate classes for this very reason, is I would go and take a class and somebody would say something about an anatomy, or they would say something about, oh, well, this muscle does this, or this exercise does this, and it was wrong. And I used to get really pissed about it. And now I've learned that that's not, I take my PT hat off. I'm still learning. Like I just pick up something this morning, an exercise I want to try out. But it very much is, if I nitpick on everybody, then it's not gonna be time for me, so I have to kinda step out of that space. Or if I'm going to go in a space and learn something about how those things are connected, it's very intentional who those voices are and who those people are. So I go into a space being like, "Okay, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, but I'm just here for the workout." Good news, bad news, I don't know. That's how I get to go to classes now. So
I used to have a like a weightlifting instructor who
mhm.
gave the worst cues for overhead shoulder stuff. And one
Yeah.
day I was very patient, and one day I pulled him aside and I said, you know, another option is this. I did
Mhm.
it in the most diplomatic way. I showed him,
Yeah.
and I even like did a little muscle testing in the two different positions. And then, sure enough, next class, he's like, pull your shoulders away from your ears as your arm goes overhead. And I was like, Okay.
Okay, okay. So, no, I'm the same way. Like I have to be in the right space to like
Mhm,
educate, but I think,
mhm.
to that point, um, again, it's important to know what information to expect from what people. But for
Yeah,
me, um, I've always, if I'm going to talk or speak to yoga, um, I have some experience in that. I've sat in classes. I've gone to like we've met up a couple times, I think, where guest speakers came in and did special classes and things like that. Um, like that's where I feel like kind of like the rubber meets the road. Like if I'm going to speak to something, I want to sit in there and experience it. Like I went to CrossFit for a whole year before I let anybody know that I was a PT because I was like, I want to learn. I want to, same thing with Pilates. Like,
yeah,
and so I think if you're curious about yoga, and it's something you're thinking about integrating, regardless of pregnancy, postpartum status, that sort of thing, like it's important to kind of find a voice, one that you actually like. And I literally mean actual voice. Because there's some people I cannot stand their voice, and there's other people like you have this lovely, soothing voice that just makes me so chilled out. But other people are like fingernails on a chalkboard. Obviously, the CrossFit voice is not going to go well in a yoga studio. 3, 2, 1. No, we're not good there. But there's a time and a place in the space. So again, it's like finding that comfort part, finding that culture fit, but also understanding where that expertise is. And again, we're really lucky in this area. I know Megan Brown, her yoga and Pilates studio, Mind the Mat. They've got some great pregnancy and postpartum yoga instructors that I feel really confident in. Like it again, it's finding that mash up of all of those things, which I think can be it can take a little while, but once you start to find that and know what resonates with you and find the good information, it can be incredibly helpful. Now you have a ton of resources online at Yoga Academy.com. I had to go slowly there. Yoga Anatomy
yeah.
Academy. You've got your YouTube channel, and then you've got some free resources up there as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I have a fairly robust YouTube channel. In this year, I've been trying to add a class at least once a week, or a class every week, and then sometimes some other shorter videos or other videos. And I've really enjoyed that. I've got more than 20,000 subscribers, so it's a good feeling that I'm able to help folks from all over the world. I also, during the pandemic, taught online yoga for a good year and a half, if not more. And in that time, I developed like a great cadre of, probably my most common demographic was
Mm.
women in their 70s.
Oh,
And
no
that made
kidding.
me so happy
That's so
because
cool.
my mom would come to
I was
class.
gonna say, my mom goes to
Yeah.
yoga. I love that she does that, which is not
Yes.
anything I would have ever thought as a kid. But it also makes me feel a little hopeful that, like, if the CrossFit thing dies or I can't, run anymore, that I've always got yoga as an option.
Yeah, and the style of yoga that I was teaching is like maybe from the outside looking in wouldn't look like it would be that challenging,
Hmm.
but because it wasn't fast paced, we weren't picking up little 2-pound weights or anything like that. But it was, I was teaching these kind of sneaky strengthening things that
See,
could then
strengthening.
you'd feel it the next day. So it's really like taking the best of Pilates without the dogma, taking the best of asana with hopefully very little dogma, and then just bringing it into a place that was just pure mindfulness, pure
Yeah.
like mind body mapping, strengthening, things that from a PT perspective, a lot of my patients need.
Yeah.
And so that was really fun. That entire library exists, and it's only like 20 bucks a month to join that. So
That's
that
awesome.
exists at Yoga Anatomy Academy in the on demand section.
I
And
have to
then
tell
I
you. Oh,
actually,
go ahead.
yeah, tell me.
No, I was gonna say when the class that I think I told you I went to, like, I was in my 30s and pregnant, and it was all, like, mid-60s to late 60-year-old women. I was like, "Nope, this is my pace. I can do this." So, there's something to be said for that.
Yeah. I think actually a lot of women in their 60s and 70s are underestimated.
Yep,
And
I plan to be one of those.
understandably, that generation doesn't feel super comfortable in other in various other movement contexts.
Spaces. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
movement spaces for
Yeah.
sure,
Well, and
but quite
they sort of
understandably. Yeah.
but I've had all these conversations about how our moms were kind of that first generation to be like, hey, we're going to work out. Granted, they were still navigating the whole weight loss thing, but like, we're going to work out to work out. And so
Mhm.
I love to hear that that was the demographic that was, so good for you, because again, that gives me hope kind of looking forward that we're just going to continue to stay active for sure. So awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Dr.
Well,
Ariele Foster.
specifically for your crew, though, I am
Yeah.
putting together something that is a kind of a no-nonsense Malasana deep squat tutorial.
Ooh,
And the reason for
fantastic.
this is because a lot of the folks throwing out the word pelvic floor in the yoga space are teaching people how to get into this deep squat, which
Gotcha.
is something that's very practical. It can be very helpful. I teach it in a way that allows you to figure out if it's your ankles or your knees or your hips
Love it.
limiting you. And that's going to be, let's do my.yogaanatomyacademy.com slash, I won't say Malasana, I'll say slash Carrie.
All right. I like it.
Slash
I like
Carrie.
it. We'll toss that in the show notes too. So awesome. So say that one more time.
Sure. So to go directly there, it would be my.yogaanatomyacademy.com slash
Backslash Carrie.
Carrie,
Awesome.
Carrie. Yeah, and that'll
Awesome.
be just like a free course for the
Awesome.
folks who are.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. We like the goodies. We like the goodies. Thank you. All right. If you want to find out more about Dr. Ariele Foster, you can find her on Instagram at dr.ariele.foster, or as we mentioned, at yogaanatomyacademy.com. Thank you, as always. You are my go-to as far as all things yoga, and so glad that we got to connect. And thank you for being so generous with all of our listeners today. So thanks so much for being on.
thank you for having me.